To.
Yeah,
What's going on, Mark? How you been, man?
I've been good, man. Looking forward to another session of reef therapy.
Yeah, I think a weekly cadence is very good for the Reef Aquarium soul. You
Yeah,
told me your coal tang had a little run-in with the convict tang, or vice versa.
yeah, he beat the crap out of my convict. I mean, they're getting along again, so it happened when I wasn't looking, but he's got a nice 1 inch gash on the side of him. But he's swimming around and eating, so I'm not going to pull him and medicate him or anything like that. I'll just keep a close eye on him.
Yeah, no, that's important. I definitely do a lot of observation, and sometimes you see something in reef fish that you really feel like you should do something, but I just kind of wait until it reaches that point where, like, all right, that fish needs some TLC. I think your
Yeah,
fish will be fine. I have plenty of tangs that have gotten gashes over the years, and they go away real fast.
yeah, yeah. It was just, you go check on your tank, look around, see if anything's unusual. And I was like, ooh, dang. So,
So we have a great topic for everyone today about reef aquarium misconceptions, and it's kind of astonishing how much information we think are gospel that have not really stood up to critical examination.
yeah, it's the thing about the internet is it definitely gives you access to a lot of information, but it also gives you a lot of access to misinformation. And without that editorial factor, there's also that repetition of information, right? People just they hear something and then they repeat it to the next person, and it becomes gospel or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Before we get started, I'll rarely do this, but I want to plug the brand new Coral Finder 2021 edition. People are always asking, how do I identify my corals? This is a great guide that has been worked on by Russell Kelly. I actually dove with him a couple years ago on the Great Barrier Reef. And this is not going to tell you any goofy names. It's not going to tell you any made up names. These are the actual scientific names. And so in previous years, he used Charlie Varen's pictures from Corals of the World, but he's just gone out of his way to create his own photographs to really illustrate the differences between some of the common and obscure genera of stony corals. So definitely go to byoguides.com and check it out if you really want to learn something about stony corals from the Indo-Pacific. So,
I got mine in the mail yesterday.
oh, you did? Awesome. What did you
Yep.
think?
Oh, I like it. Yeah, I ordered it, and I thought it was going to come all the way from Australia for some reason, but it shipped U.S., so it arrived very quickly. I was pleasantly surprised.
Russell Kelly, he's been working at this. I think this is the fourth one, but he's going to start doing like an annual edition. And he told me that now he's got a kind of a new publisher that has 11 presses all over the world.
Oh, dang.
So yeah, I ordered mine and I got it within a few days. I was quite surprised. I want to let people know we're not going to be plugging stuff all the time, but I feel like that's a really useful tool for identifying the real names of aquarium corals. So. All right, you ready to get started on some reef aquarium misconceptions?
Let's do it. This will be a fun one.
It'll be a fun one because for like 10 to 15 to 20 years, I'm like, no, that's not true. That's not true. And there's definitely a lot of things people think they know about the reef aquarium hobby that they want to believe. They want to believe that this bottle of miracle cure is going to be the silver bullet. They want to believe that ABC fish eats XYZ pest, and it's just not true. So the first misconception I want to bring up is that reef aquariums are hard. What do you say about that, Mark?
I think there is. I mean, they'll always have their trials and tribulations, right? It's rare for your tank not to be, you know, I don't know. You have those moments of autopilot, but you're always gonna have your little battles with something. But I think it is as complicated or as hard as you make it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's what you choose to keep, what size it is, everything, right? And I definitely feel like if I was a newbie jumping in and I start watching a bunch of videos and seeing people with their setups, we've all been there where the non-saltwater hobbyist comes to your house and goes, "Oh, I've always heard those saltwater tanks are hard." And I think if you're a newbie and you saw some of the plumbing and all the gadgetry on tanks lately, you would also be under that impression because there's complexity in learning all those additional gadgets, right? A calcium reactor is not a very simple thing, right? You're putting CO2 into a semi-pressurized chamber and you're doing a drip rate and bubble. So
The funny thing about a calcium reactor is if you have a calcium reactor, you can't do anything with it, right? You need media, you need a CO2 tank, you
yeah.
need a pressure regulator, you need a solenoid valve, you need a pH controller with a pH probe, maybe even a dosing pump to feed it. But we approach all those things one at a time, but if you set
Yeah.
up a basic tank with no filter, a little bit of water flow, a heater and some light, your zoanthus are never going to give you problems. If you
Right.
set up a similar tank with just an anemone, a pair of clownfish, man, you're going to be bored with that tank. It's just going to look beautiful. You're not going to have to do anything.
And when you get bored with it, then you start diving into the more complexity of, setting up things like, I find adding this A and B solution every few days drives me kind of crazy. Oh, well, you could set up a dosing pump. Oh, what's that? And then you go down that path of learning the more complex intricacies of how you can, set up a saltwater aquarium further. But to your point, you don't need all of that. You could set up a great tank with some very hardy corals with very minimal effort.
And by and large, the reef aquarium hobby, 90+% of reef aquariums are trying to recreate something very unnatural, right?
Mhm.
We're trying to keep soft corals on the left, stony corals at the top, LPS at the bottom, all kinds of fish and corals that do not come from the same environment. That's where the issues come, right? I have a
Mhm.
dedicated Euphilia tank. That thing is dialed in. All my acros, I don't try to keep any trachees or scalemias in there because that would just be so hard. So yeah, reef aquariums are definitely not hard. It's like you said, it's what you make of it. All right, how about the next one? And this is one that's, oh man, this is a whole can of worms, but the fact that before someone is instructed on how to keep a reef tank, they have to have a crash course in water purification. There's absolutely this notion that you have to have a reverse osmosis unit to have a saltwater tank.
Yeah, I think that's one of those perfect examples of people don't like to dive into the particulars. So a blanket answer is the easiest path where if you don't need an RO unit, it's not necessarily going to help or hurt you from where whether you treat it or not. I mean, if you have pretty good water quality, you could just get by with less. So if you take 30 people and you don't say, well, you need to dive into the particulars. Let's talk about what type of water is coming into your house. Are there any seasonal changes, this and that? That gets complicated. Whereas if you just tell everybody, yeah, you need an RO unit, whether you need it or not, it's a blanket answer. But I agree with you because it's a complex thing to deal with. It's expensive. I mean, relatively speaking.
A mid-range reverse osmosis unit could cost you as much as a basic small reef tank.
Yeah. And I said that in our last reef therapy that I always said with nanos, in the evaporation, right? When I'm thinking of a kid getting into the hobby, it's kind of a hard sell to convince mom and dad to set up a reverse osmosis unit, I think. I mean, I'm sure plenty do, but it's a tricky sell, I think, to have to deal with that.
It's a learning curve before you can get started on your aquarium. So just for the record, you and I started out at a time when reverse osmosis units were like very specialized. They were like, very expensive, especially as a youngster, and very complicated, and you might flood and so many other things. But So I think we have a different point of view as far as like starting out with our tap water purifiers. I
I
know we
remember
talked about
those.
this a little bit.
Yep.
But my water's pretty pure. You know, I have 2 ppm of silicates. I have a little bit of calcium, a little bit of magnesium, and I get pulses of copper. And instead of setting up an RO unit, I just set up a bunch of carbon blocks. Almost everything you want to remove that you really have to remove, any kind of heavy metals, carbon's going to take care of it. I know a lot of people are concerned maybe about like phosphates in your water, and okay, that might be one of those cases, but that information is widely available now on the internet. You can actually go to your specific municipality of water treatment and find out what's in your water before you get into a reverse osmosis unit.
Yeah, I mean, my pre-RO water is 20 parts per million TDS. I don't know what is in that TDS, right? I don't know what it's comprised of. I've been wanting to get it tested. My local water supply doesn't get too into the details of what's in the tap, and then there's the factor of, okay, that's the water treatment plant, but by the time it gets to my house, goes through my plumbing, what else is added? But I've always been curious to see, like, do I really need this thing, or could I get away with some carbon blocks with 20 parts per million? I do think my water's high in iron because of where I live. We got a lot of red clay around here.
That is
But
the
yeah.
most effective way to take out iron. But the other thing with the RO is people assume that a reverse osmosis is absolute, but it works on percentages. So if you have high copper or high iron or high phosphate, you're still going to have a percentage of that getting through. And, it's like, all right, well, then you add a DI, anion, cation, mixed bed resin to after your RO, but then now you're adding a whole bunch more complexity where it's like, you could fix that with just the carbon.
Yeah, I agree. My new tank that still hasn't come yet, but I've debated, do I just fill it up with tap water? And then I've got some old RO housings, right, pre-filter housings, and I could just throw some carbon in one and throw maybe some $20 DI resin in the other and run it for a couple of days with a power head, while the tank is
That's another
circulating.
one that just seems like you're not really connecting the dots. When you set up a brand new tank with purified water, the whole point of a new tank in order to get the cycle going is you kind of need to get it dirty. You're going to be doing a lot of processing before you put anything in there. So just fill it up with tap, man. Just fill it up with tap. But it's always just sat very strangely with me that seawater is well known to have pretty much every single element on the periodic table, and we go to such great lengths to strip everything out just so we can add it back in. And I get it, maybe if you have very hard water, a lot of calcium, a lot of carbonates in your water, if you use a readily available salt mix, you might be starting out with very elevated levels. But that should be taken on a case-by-case basis and not a blanket, you need an RO purification center.
Yeah, I mean, I think if people are willing to get into the particulars, look at what your tap water analysis looks like, maybe evaluate if there's seasonal changes like spring runoff and stuff that maybe brings in some extra factors that you're worried about. And then make a decision based on that, but don't go on the gospel that everybody needs to purify their water, right? And that's why you see like threads online where people are like, oh, I run my tank on tap water, and it's like, oh, you're such a rebel. And it's like, well, it probably works for him. It may not work for the next person depending on their water source, but neither person is wrong, or in a bad place to set up a reef tank. You may need it, you may not. It's a decision.
That's a great point, though. You talk about seasonal changes. So, before I started up the studio, I set my water off for ICP testing a few different places. They concurred on the silicate level in my water, but none of them showed the copper. It took me a while to figure out they had a copper, and that was coming in pulses. And I don't know where it's coming from. Again, it's seasonal. It's like very intermittent. And I'm like, you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna use a ton of carbon blocks. So that works for me. All right. You got any other misconceptions? You want to take the next misconception? You got one at the top of your brain?
I've got a couple. This goes a little bit back to the naming conventions of corals, but more generic in the sense that you have these stereotypes around the care of corals, whether they're LPS, SPS, softies.
Good one.
And that drives me crazy because there are LPS softies that stonies, stony soft corals. Whether the polyps are small or large, right? Like that doesn't really dictate necessarily what environment they come from, what kind of type of situation they would thrive in, and even when you talk about soft corals. Many soft corals that are considered low light or, that regard high nutrient, low light, yes, they may tolerate that, but you put some of those, type of softies in a high light, high flow environment, and it's a different coral. It'll thrive, it'll be. So then the question is, well, it's like, all right, which do you think it actually prefers?
That's an
that
excellent point. The SPS and LPS, small polyp stony, large polyp stony designations came from the aquarium hobby, and it's just a generalization. Mm-hmm. And what do you do about those corals in the middle of the range? Is a Cyphastria, is that a small polyp coral, or is that a medium polyp coral? Leptoceras, I would say that's a small polyp coral, but that grows really low. And the same thing what you said about the soft corals. When you're diving the reef, you'll find a lot more soft corals in the shallows and really bright water, and then you find a good amount in midwater. But once you get down deep, you might find a few sarcophytons, but the only soft corals down there are non-photosynthetic. Once you get down into the really low light reef. There's going to be photosynthetic stony corals, but non-photosynthetic soft corals. But that's a great point. LPS and SPS is just a loose category. Very, very loose.
And you see like PAR recommendations for SPS corals and PAR recommendations for LPS corals. And I don't quite understand that. Mm-hmm. Again, I see the point of you can get away with spending less maybe in lighting and flow for certain types of corals because maybe their range of tolerance is a lot larger. Mm-hmm. But if we're in the hobby and we're trying to grow these corals as well as possible and as nicely as possible, I think, throw softies in high par, right? Like that's to me, that doesn't make sense that you would make those recommendations, especially with LEDs where you're not necessarily spending less money. You have the same set of lights, but you're adjusting the values in your little app, right? Mm-hmm. And like these are the recommended values for an LPS tank, and these are the recommended. You should put your violets to this and that percentage for SPS, and it's like that makes the most sense to me. You go scuba dive, or better yet, go snorkel because you go into a shallow environment. And I've seen lobophytums, sarcophytums in several feet of water, just right there, just getting hammered by waves.
Yeah.
And they're amazingly large and beautiful. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's, why not replicate that?
Yeah, no, that's an awesome point. I can't think of any other great examples, but SPS and LPS really just, that designation only works at the extremes, And, I think candy coral is a perfect example. I've seen that coral in 3 feet of water. I've seen it on 100 feet. It grows very different, but it'll be the same strain, but it's also acclimated to those conditions. So definitely be mindful of what you think SPS and LPS means. That was a good one. I didn't have that one on my list.
I've seen tabling acros like down 100 feet, right? So anyway.
All right, well, since we're talking about SPS, oh my God, I just want to bang my head against the wall when people are waiting like 3 to 6 months, A, to add corals to their reef, B, to add SPS to their reef. And I guess it's kind of a two-parter. Let's just start with people should be cycling their tanks with corals and not fish. What do you say about that?
I agree wholeheartedly. It seems rather cruel to use like a fish to get the bacterial thing going in an aquarium. Whereas, obviously fish waste and all of that has bacteria in it, and you've got bacteria in a bottle these days. But a coral is an organism that is farming, dinoflagellates in its tissues that require fuel. And it's usually on a little piece of rock or something that's loaded with bacteria and other microorganisms. It doesn't care about, how mature your tank is. It's, to me, some sacrificial frags is the better way to go, and actually contributes to the jump starting of that biological life cycle, or whatever you call it, the nitrifying cycle and everything else. To me, it's akin to like adding fast growing plants to a freshwater aquarium to get it going, versus like, I'm going to burn this fish's gills with ammonia and hope he makes it,
So that's a great point. I think it's safe to say that the roots of the saltwater aquarium hobby started in the freshwater world, right? That's what you would do. It's super natural to take everything you know about freshwater. Let's rewind it to the 1950s, 1960s. You would just apply the same principles of freshwater to your saltwater tank and proceed from there. But man, it's been like 70 years of saltwater aquarium keeping, and no one has ever explained to me any mechanism by which a coral can be affected by the low levels of ammonia or nitrite. So just to get a little nerdy on folks, ammonia and nitrite interferes with hemoglobin's ability to absorb oxygen, and that's what burns the gills of fish and keeps them from being able to breathe. But corals don't rely on blood. They don't have blood. They don't have hemoglobin. So as far as I can tell, I mean, obviously a certain level of ammonia they're not going to be happy with, but you're usually feeding the fish a ton of food, not the corals a ton of food. And like you said, they're a self-contained little micro ecosystem with all kinds of bacteria on and inside of them and their bases. And yeah, cycling tanks with fish is just, that should become an archaic practice.
Well, and when you take somebody that waits, 3 weeks to fill up their 200-gallon tank with their 20-gallon per day RO unit, and then they put dead rock in it, and then they put some fish in it, and then they wait, half a century before they put a coral in. It's like, I don't know. It just, there's so much wrong in that, in my opinion.
I get it that, it's natural for the hobbyists and stores to have people go slowly and proceed slowly. But one, I've set up a bunch of tanks here in the Reef Builder studio lately, and man, the only thing that slows me down from putting corals in there is figuring out exactly where I want them. I will always start out with what I call an indicator coral, a canary in the coal mine with good polyp extension. Duncan's one of my favorites. Any kind of, again, sacrificial hammer coral is also another good one because they have such large polyps. You can just kind of judge the well-being of the tank by their polyp extension. But if you add a bunch of corals at once, that is akin to literally adding live rock to your aquarium aquascape, right? Even the poop from the coral is just going to be like little squirts of bacterial diversity and microbial diversity that's going to get your tank started in a way that adding fish won't. Not to mention, they're not going to have nearly the same impact on your aquarium. If you want to wait a long time to cycle your tank, do it with corals. Don't do it with fish.
Yeah, it's funny too. When people have had ick problems and they have to go fallow on the reef, right? They take all their fish out. They're like, "What am I going to do with my corals?" Like, I've seen that question posted on the internet, and I'm like, "Your tanks could be fine without fish." It's there's plenty going on in there. I find that interesting. And even if you're just getting into it and you don't have like another tank to pull some, as you put a canary in a coal mine corals. I mean, the sacrificial cheap fast growing corals, right? Like they're not expensive. There's usually somebody that can, is trying to get rid of something that you can take a few frags of, throw it in
And
there.
we're
If
talking
you really
corals here. Coral, not zoanthids, because zoanthids will live in a
Right.
toilet.
Yeah.
And a few other corals too, but man, straight along those same lines, and I'm going to bring in like a great example that almost everybody's seen is like SPS corals, they don't care how old your tank is, right? They do not care if it's an hour old or a year old. All they care about is that you can maintain the chemistry, right? That you can maintain your parameters.
Yeah.
I get it that people want to be cautious. Again, we're not like dogging people who take their time. We just want to point out these facts that like the coral doesn't care how old your tank is. It doesn't care. An acropore does not care if coralline is growing in the tank.
Well, and I get to some degree the uglies, as they call it, right? The phase where you go through maybe some diatoms and some other stuff. Those type of breakouts can irritate some corals, right? But I would rather be dealing with those with a competitor like corals in my tank and whatever they bring along for the ride, right? I mean, you see it with people battling dinos, right? They're starting to add more diversity, and that helps fix that that lack of equilibrium that lets dinos thrive, right? So again, yeah, there's some corals that are not going to be too happy with a cyano outbreak, and you might have to go in there with a turkey baster and clean them off and stuff, but there's plenty of corals that'll do just fine in that kind of environment and help, in my opinion, and this may be anecdotal, but help you along the journey of getting out of the ugly phase with your tank.
Yeah. Well, guess I'm privileged to have so many corals now. I can set up a tank instantly, and the thing that slows me down the most is like, where do I want to put the corals? But one great example of this whole issue of cycling reef tanks and SPS corals is like, you go to a reef show, those are all instant aquariums. I get that they're not feeding them. I get that they're not long term, but for 3 or 4 days, those corals look amazing, and there's no fish in there. There's no fish in there to pollute the aquarium. All right. Do you have another misconception you want to bring up?
This one I think is now a little more, I think people are more knowledgeable on this one, but in the past it was a common misconception, and that was protein skimmer sizing. I mean, one, is a protein skimmer even necessary? That should be the first question sometimes based on, how you set up your tank. But, there's been a lot of examples of oversizing a skimmer. And, you see tank ratings for skimmers. Now you're starting to see the ratings be more driven towards the biological load, which is good. I think that really helps.
I think Red Sea does a good job on their Red Sea reefer. They have, like a, what is it? Like, I just generalizing, right? Like a 100-gallon SPS tank, a 200-gallon, mixed reef tank, and then like a 300-gallon, fish-only tank. So that's definitely the better way to do it.
Tunzi was, I think, one of the first to do that with their skimmers. I remember they would have recommendations based on bioload. But yeah, I mean, that one I think is a little more common. Somebody just getting into the hobby may not be aware of that. But, I would rather have an undersized skimmer than an oversized skimmer any day.
Really? You wouldn't have larger skimmer and just kind of reduce the air or reduce the flow? I know you did this for a while where you ran your skimmer like 6 hours a day or something.
A long time ago. Yeah.
I mean, I'd rather have a large skimmer per se. But I'd rather have an easy to use skimmer. Actually, I don't really care on the size.
Yeah.
A reliable one.
I haven't. I mean, the only DC power skimmer I've used is a Tunzi on a smaller tank. But so those are great because you have more levers to pull. But back in the AC skimmer days,
we're still in those days.
Yeah. No, my current tank runs an AC pump skimmer. When the skimmer was undersized, it skimmed consistently. Like it was always churning. There was always something in the cup. Whereas when
I see what you're getting at, yeah.
Yeah, and when it's oversized, I would experience like these ebbs and flows. I can't say one is better than the other, but I like consistency. I like knowing like this many days I got to empty it, clean it, and I've had it where the skimmer does nothing, and then boom, all of a sudden I don't know if the proteins in the water build up to a certain threshold, and then all of a sudden it's able to produce enough foam to do something. But in that regard, I find an undersized skimmer a little more manageable. And I honestly don't notice a difference in terms of anything related to nitrates or phosphates with the,
Well, kind
upsizing
of getting
it.
back to our first point about reef aquariums are hard. If I set up a reef tank, man, I'm not turning on the protein skimmer or adding a protein skimmer for like a month. You want
Yeah.
to let those nutrients build up, right? You have to feed the bacteria to cycle your tank and everything. So,
Same with dosing, right? I mean, people will start dosing and they don't really have much coral biomass yet to account for that.
right.
You can get away with water changes for a very long time, or even just, might get by just without water changes for at least a month or two.
Yeah, no, you want to let it get dirty. And, I'll start out a reef tank without a skimmer or just don't turn it on. And then as things progress, I might start using a little bit of carbon and then use a little bit of pio pellets or use a ketomorpho reactor. But yeah, and then there's definitely, I don't want to totally get on protein skimmers because I feel like we can save that for a full episode.
Sure.
But I've always had this this concept of what I call low-hanging proteins. Like there's some heavy proteins that are really easy to remove, and then you just have to work that much harder to get like the medium weight proteins, and then the lightest scum it's diminishing returns when it comes to protein skimming. All
Yeah, I
right.
agree.
All right. How about Reef Safe?
Hmm.
I think Reef Safe is less useful than SPS and LPS designations. Reef Safe does not mean what you think it means.
Yeah, what is reef safe? Like, what is the definition of it being reef safe?
Let me
right?
try. I would
Okay.
say Reef Safe is something that's not going to pick at your corals, not going to pick at your crustaceans, not going to pick on small fish, but at its most elemental, Reef Safe should mean it's not going to eat actual coral. Right? I would say things that are not reef safe absolutely would be butterfly fish and parrotfish. Because you see people keeping orange spotted filefish in their reef tanks. But
Yep.
they literally eat coral. But by the very definition of reef safe, you would say that an orange spotted filefish is not reef safe, right?
Well, and what I've learned with angelfish, the larger angelfish, right, is they can be, in my experience, rather particular about what corals they like to eat. So, you can throw a regal angel into a reef tank, and it'll, in my experience, annihilate your zoanthids, probably go after your xenia, but that's it. I mean, I had LPS clams, and I mean everybody's experience varies with angelfish.
Mhm.
But the best advice I ever got from someone who was really into angelfish was, if you really love the fish enough, you'll put it in your tank. It'll eat what it eats. You'll realize which corals you can and cannot keep, and you just adjust course. And now you have a nice reef tank with a more specific set of corals, but with a really nice angelfish. And I mean, in a way, that's still like it's reef safe for that reef, for that particular reef aquarium.
It's so
In
funny.
that regard.
Angelfish are my favorite, but I have tons of tangs because I cannot enjoy a reef tank when an angelfish is picking at one thing. I added a flame angelfish to a 100-gallon tank with a huge variety of corals, and it only picked on the Pasillipora and then like one Duncan. I had to take it out. I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't let it be in there, like picking on just a few of those corals. But you're bringing up a great point, and a few fish that would be considered not reef safe that you can absolutely keep in a reef tank would be lionfish, groupers,
Mm-hmm.
tuskfish. Like most of those guys, they're not going to eat your. They're not going to eat your snails. They're not going to touch your corals. They won't look at anemones. They'll eat little fish. They'll eat little shrimp. Tusk might toss some things around that aren't nailed down, but even some of the larger wrasses, right? They get like say, and it changes as they get bigger. I think a perfect example would be Leonardi wrasse. They're so small and beautiful. They're kind of like a femininus, But man, a full super male is going to get like 10, 12 inches with some, serious dentition to literally pick up a good medium-sized coral to see what's underneath it.
Well, it's funny you say that about the tuskfish, right? For me, that's a fish I've always wanted, but I have a hard time accepting the risk of losing like cleanup crew, which sounds so funny because that should be way more sacrificial. Snails are cheap, right?
Right.
But that's the one thing that keeps me hesitating. But when it comes to angels, I really don't. I mean, I don't keep very rare, expensive name brand corals, but so I'm happy to adjust course with what kind of corals I keep for a fish that I really like. But when you start messing with like shrimp and snails, then I get kind of annoyed.
Yeah. No, I mean, I guess it's safe to say that Reef Safe is a useful definition, but it's also very fluid, very much dependent on what kind of fish we're talking about and what kind of corals we're talking about. So
Well, it's we said it with the RODI. It's a blanket answer when really the solution is to dive into the particulars, right? Is this fish reef safe? Well, that depends, right? But people don't want to have answers in the particulars, right? They want to just have a blanket answer, and
that is the issue, man. That is really the issue at stake here. If you want just a silver bullet answer, this is going to apply to everything that we're talking about. It's a very broad generalization, and reef safe is definitely one of those words. I'm just like, is that really helping?
yeah.
All right. Along those same lines, man, that people want to believe something. It just kills me when people say that spring-eyed damselfish eat flatworms, or dragonface pipefish will eat, red bugs, Tagastes acroporianus off of your acroporas, and I just find that simply untrue. Man, I have just like non-damaging flatworms on some LPS corals in my 100-gallon tank. I got 8 spring-eyed damselfish in there, man. They don't go anywhere near the turbine area that actually has some flatworms on it. And I know that some wrasses will definitely do it. Some wrasses can be trained to do it, right? If you're blasting flatworms and kind of showing them that there's a little bit food bits on the coral, some of them can be trained, but man, there's a whole bunch of information. I was like, oh, you have this problem? Just buy this fish.
I saw somebody posting about a blenny that eats Aptasia.
Yeah, so the Molly Miller blenny is one of those hidden secrets that eats Aptasia. It's a blenny that eats Aptasia. I've personally never had one in my own tanks. I've kept them at aquarium stores, and yeah, sure enough, they're not going to eat like your giant Aptasia, but they're going to eat like little ones that, they don't have the dentition to like get into the rock. But if there's a small Aptasia just kind of in plain sight, yeah, they'll definitely eat them. And there's a lot of uncommon knowledge like that. But there's also more urban legends about fish that are supposed to do something that actually don't do that.
I've always had the question of, especially when it comes to fish, if they'll eat Aptasia, what else will they eat, right?
That's an excellent point. I think a great example for that is the Bristletail filefish, right?
Yep.
So wild specimens. I've had some wild ones, ate the hell out of Aptasia, and, then got a liking for zoanthids. But one thing where aquaculture really steps in is I believe biota trains their Bristletail filefish on Aptasia, and then they've never seen anything else besides prepared foods. So you put those guys in an aquarium, I think it's really rare that those guys will pick on something else. Not out of the question, but I have one that surfs back and forth in the back partition of one of my aquariums. He goes back there, eats Aptasia, swims over to the main display, and eats some more Aptasia. It's really cool.
Yeah, I remember doing a behind-the-scenes tour at the Georgia Aquarium, and they had an Aptasia problem, and they put a bunch of raccoon butterfly fish in, which at the time backfired on them because then they found that it was eating some other things as well, and they were trying to catch them and get them out. And that just, to me, it's like, well, if you eat, an Idarian, like, I mean, they can have their preferences, right? Just like the Regal Angel would eat my zoanthus, but not really touch any fleshy LPS or anything like that. But especially when it's a fish that you're using to target a pest, I'm always like, well, they're omnivorous, and they're not going to exclusively eat that, right?
I'm a big critic of aquaculture. I feel like they should be doing more to make better fish, and that's a whole nother session. But this is one of those cases that, if you raise a bristletail filefish in captivity, it's never seen any other critter. It's never grazed on the reef and have the buffet of different food items available to it. And you've fed it prepared foods, and you've presented it with Aptasia. Man, those fish are going to hit the aquarium being a pretty model citizen.
So that's a question for you. This is something I've heard a lot, and I've been skeptical of. Fish that are known to eat corals but are captive bred and captive raised, I often hear them being as described as like, oh, well, those are reef safe, right? These captive bred Singapore angels have been raised on pellets, and they're reef safe, and they're not going to eat your corals like the wild ones do. I'm skeptical of that.
Oh man, that's a toughie.
But I have no proof, right? I've never kept.
Well, that's a toughie because on my end, like, I prioritize the lusciousness and vitality of my corals above all else, right? That's why I have a dedicated fish tank where I can do whatever I want fishy wise over there. And if there's a flame angel that's picking on 2 out of 100 corals in a reef tank, he's out. So. Man, I'm not really sure that Singapore angels actually eat corals in the wild. I've observed them quite a bit. Corals don't taste good, unless you're really made for eating that kind of food. There's just so much better food to have on a natural reef. So I can't really comment on the Singapore angels, but I don't know. I don't think Singapore angels get enough credit, first of all.
That's a fish I've always wanted to keep, but it's I've been worried about keeping that one. There's sacrificing some corals, but I've heard some scary stories with Singapores, and I like to keep like tridacnids and stuff, so I'd be a little worried.
Tridacnids are giant clams for the uninitiated.
Yeah,
he's talking that old school talk. Tridacnids. All right, here's one of my favorites. I don't want to get that wrasse because it needs sand, and my tank is bare bottom.
I've fallen for that one.
First of all, fairy wrasses, flasher wrasses, 6 lines, 4 lines, cleaner wrasses, they don't sleep under the sand. They go find a rock and go underneath it and just go find a nook. Leopard wrasses, Anamses, including Femininus, including the Lenardi wrasses, they like to sleep in the sand. And then there's a whole nother category of razor wrasses that just Navuculops and Xerichthus, they are just highly adapted, laterally flattened fish that just go deep in the sand. These are the videos you've seen of dolphins using echolocation to locate fish underneath the sand. Those are the kind of wrasses that it would be kind of cruel to keep them away from their natural environment, which is really sand diving. I don't cater to sissy fishes. Like I said when I was talking about my mangrove tank, I grow my mangroves in 2 little fishies refugiite, a deep layer, and then I put some heavy stones on top of that specifically so my leopard wrasse wouldn't be diving into it and spreading the sand all over the place. You know what? I've had all kinds of leopard wrasses and anamses, and they'll go find a rock, man. They'll go find a spot. They'll go hide over there. The wrasses don't need the sand. I mean, you're literally talking about a security blanket.
I've fallen for that one.
What fish was it?
I think partly leopard wrasse. I had it in a bare bottom tank, and I felt the need to put a Tupperware in there with sand, right?
I wouldn't say you fell for it. That's you're just trying to give the animal the best it can. But I just push back against people who say, "Oh, I have a bare bottom tank, therefore I can't keep all these wrasses." And I'm like, most wrasses do not sleep under the sand. Once again, You drill down into what it is you're trying to do, what you're trying to keep, to find out some of these secondary and tertiary details.
Well, it's similar to, you think about a lot of the fish that we keep our surface grazers, right?
What are you thinking of?
And eventually,
What are you thinking of, surface grazers?
I'll use the same example, a regal angel, right? If anyone's ever brought in a regal angel, it's fun because training them to eat, you use clams on the half shell, and then maybe you put other kinds of food in the clam shells because they are used to grazing off of a surface, and there's pellet food floating around in the water, and it doesn't register in their brain. And the one I kept, for example, was like that for like a year. And then one day, it just, like, maybe it was just watching all the other fish. It was like, you know what the hell? And it just started eating pellets out of the water column. But it's that same kind of concept of, maybe we need to give fish a little more credit in their adaptability, right? Whether it be a wrasse needing
Preach,
sand
Brother
or,
Mark. Preach.
they'll figure it out.
You know what I find funny too is like when you get angelfish and they first learn how to eat food from the column, they still like twitch their head really hard, like they're ripping something off. And it takes a really long time for them to stop doing that. But yeah, I really believe in not coddling aquarium fish. Present them with flake. Present them with pellets. Present them with frozen food. They don't have to have live food. But man, I'm a big flake and pellet feeder. And to me, once a fish is eating flake or pellets, it's like home free, like a tricky fish, like a regal angelfish.
Yeah, agreed.
All right. I'm just going down my list here. Do you have any misconceptions in mind? I got a big old list here.
No, I think yours are better. One that I always find amusing is this war on dinos, right? And I went through the dinoflagellate battle, and
what do you mean?
I would argue
war on dinos. Like, I really have to claim ignorance here. I don't know if it's because I'm like in the mountains in the center of the country and I don't have the spores to inoculate my tanks with that, but I don't think I've ever experienced anything approaching what people are talking about dinoflagellates. So I can't relate.
Yeah. My theory is there is a divide here between old school reefers who have just experienced dinos in the ugly phase of a setup tank, right? And those that have battled what's going on now. And I was, you'll get the advice, just put, some plastic on your tank, black out your tank for 3 days, end of story, problem solved. Or do some water changes, or you'll get like this dismissive advice from people that have been in the hobby for a very long time. And I was the same way, and then I got nailed by these dinos, and I mean, I can't explain it. Like I suddenly felt the sympathy of like, this uptick in activity on the forums of people battling these things, and these things are persistent and will not go away.
So what do you think is the misconception about dinoflagellates?
So I think there's a misconception that they are just between veteran reef keepers trying to give advice to people that maybe haven't been in the hobby as long, or, see these posts and think that this is just a matter of some algal succession, like a diatom bloom, and you just got to work it out. I definitely think they're missing the mark, that there is something interesting going on with dinoflagellates in reef tanks these days. And there's obviously a trigger. There's something different, and you and I have talked about some of my theories on that. So that's one misconception, where people who have not battled it in the way that people recently have think of it just as a succession issue, and it'll just do some simple things and it'll go away. The other part that I find interesting is that there's a vilification too, but I just feel like people should also remember that zooxanthellae are also dinoflagellates, and that goes a lot into my thinking about things, where you have to think about, like my personal experience with temperature, right? Was interesting to me, where the guy I saw on YouTube posted, hey, he noticed his nano tank was at an elevated temperature by accident, and the dinos went away. That worked for me. It didn't work for everybody. But I drew a parallel of like, well, what happens when temperatures are elevated on the reef, right? what happens to the dinoflagellates inside of corals, right? They get expelled. So is there a correlation there? Maybe not. But it's just interesting that, there's this hatred for this thing. It's like, well, there's another genus of that stuff growing in your coral tissues,
So one important thing I want people to know about dinoflagellates in general is that they're not a plant. They're a protist.
They're a protist.
They're a plant animal, an animal plant. So they can ingest stuff.
Plant-like animal.
And they can grow photosynthetically. And so it's not another algae. And two, I would say probably more so than anything else over the last 5 years, that is one of the few things that has caused experienced reefers a lot of headache. I get a lot of messages about various problems, but the only ones I get messages about from experienced reefers is dinoflagellates. And again, I can't relate. But yeah, no, like we need to understand that it's not just another species of algae. That's not the jam.
Yeah, and it's some of the plagues people are experiencing are extremely persistent, which, you're definitely battling something almost on a pathogenic level when they take over your tank versus just a diatom bloom or some of the harder to kill turf algae or something like that. It's definitely
there's well fleshed out processes for dealing with cyano, derbesia, bryopsis, enteromorpha. Like, we know how to handle that stuff, and just dinoflagellates is not another algae. It's just a whole other group of creatures, and they take a different approach. But yeah, I think the temperature thing. It's you're speeding up their metabolism, making them burn out, but also encouraging other things to take over, that ecological role.
I agree. Yeah, tilting the scale, right,
Yeah.
to favor something that is easier to battle, I guess.
Oh, I got a big one. I've been saving a big one. I don't even know what my reaction is when people acclimate corals. I have not acclimated a coral in like 15 or 20 years. It's like I acclimated. I did everything we were told to do, like freshwater fish and then saltwater fish, and acclimated my corals. And then, I got a degree in marine science and I learned more about how corals actually work. And I'm like, this is dumb. Acclimating corals demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how corals actually work. It kind of goes back to what we were just saying as far as cycling your tank, right? Corals don't have blood. They don't have lungs. They don't respire. They rely on diffusion for all of their respiratory needs, getting rid of CO2, bringing in oxygen and getting rid of waste, bringing in minerals and nutrients that they need. So a coral is literally built to be a diffusing animal.
It's self-acclimating.
It's literally self-acclimating. Just think about it. Do you think when we're collecting corals on the reef, do you think we're acclimating them to be out of water for like an hour to 3 hours on their way back to the distribution center? Do you think they literally take the time to acclimate freshly caught wild corals that have been dry for an hour into their new systems? Do you think wholesalers acclimate thousands upon thousands of corals when they get a new shipment? Now, I do know that stores might acclimate corals because they might be dealing with a few dozen or like 50 or 100, but they're self-acclimating. And it's not that, people want to give their aquarium animals the best, but the only thing you really should be acclimating are your clams, your crustaceans. Crustaceans breathe. They have a circulatory system. So if you put them into a new environment, they're going to be shocked if it's, drastically different. I do not acclimate fish I buy locally, but I will absolutely acclimate fish that I get in the mail, but I will take it to the next level. I'm not floating fish. I'm not dripping fish. I'm literally measuring the temperature, measuring the pH, and exchanging water until it gets close enough. Usually within, 1 degree and then 0.1 pH. But I'm paying attention to the details.
I worry about salinity, not so much for corals, but when it comes to acclimating fish, inverts, echinoderms and shrimp and all that, I worry mostly about salinity. I don't worry at all about temperature. Again, go scuba dive or snorkel, and you'll swim through several different gradients of temperature, and a tide will come in and the temperature will change.
Yeah, pycnocline for density, a thermocline for temperature. Right. Like you literally can be swimming through open ocean water, and you'll hit a cold layer or a warm layer, and you see fish swimming all through it. They don't care.
Well, it's funny when you see people with controllers and they keep their temperature like fluctuating less than like half a degree, so the relays in their controllers are like on off on off on off to maintain this perfectly flat line of a temperature. That doesn't happen on a reef, That's a reef doesn't stay a steady 78 degrees.
That segues.
So I don't worry about that.
That segues perfectly into another misconception about stability. Absolutely, for sure, on a very long timeline, you want stability, right? You want, a pH range. You want an alkalinity range. You want a temperature range. But just like what you said, you don't see corals bleaching at high latitudes, do ya? Those high latitudes actually experience more variation seasonally, like a much higher range. All the bleaching that's happened on the Great Barrier Reef is only happening on the north end. Granted, that's closer to the equator, so it's getting a little bit more insulation. But I was diving Great Barrier Reef. It was 69 degrees. Mm-hmm. I was wearing an 8-millimeter wetsuit surrounded by clams, Acropora, and emperor angelfish. I was dumbfounded. I was like, what the hell? Like literally looking around, kept checking my, my dive computer. I'm like, how is it 69 degrees? It's 69 degrees. I'm looking around. How are you guys doing this? Yeah, they don't care. But if you keep things too stable, if you have a little perturbation, you're going to have some issues.
Yeah, I feel that way too. I feel like more minor fluctuations actually produces a hardier reef setup, whereas people who keep everything absolutely perfect,
preach, brother Mark. Preach.
There's more of a reaction to change, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't have proof of that, but that's always
you do have proof of that. You've been
long-standing
diving.
Theory. Well,
there's a lot of fish and corals that live near the shoreline where they experience extreme tidal differences every 6 hours, 4 times a day.
Yep.
4 times a day. Some of the coral farms are literally located, for the shallow water stuff, they're literally located in an area that's easier to access. It's going to be very close to shore. It's going to have extreme tidal fluctuation, both in flow, temperature, salinity. If there's a huge rain, my God, Bali's, a rainforest.
I was going to bring that up.
It's hypertropical. How much water do you think fresh water runs off? So you're like going through all this ritual to acclimate your corals. Like, stop it. Pay attention to more important things.
Yep.
But yeah, I do want to point out, like, on a long timeline, stability is super important. But if my alkalinity spikes for some reason, I'm doing everything in my power to bring it down immediately, right? I don't have those issues, but on the same note, if like, let's just say I ran out of buffer or something in my dosing pump, and I test my water and my alkalinity just hit like 4 or 6, I will not hesitate to give it a few glugs of buffer, totalating, let's say, up to a liter of buffer for 500 gallons of water, over the course of a few hours to bring it up to 9 or 10 of that day. Same thing with calcium.
Yeah, I mean, I agree not dumping it all too quickly in the sense that you'll get a lot of precipitation or
huge pH spike.
Avoid that pH spike. But I had this happen this week. I switched 2 parts.
Oh, and, why did you switch 2 parts?
Why?
Yeah, why?
Because the one I like, I have a hard time sourcing.
Oh, is it ESV?
Yeah, ESV.
God, that's the classic. I've heard that from a few people lately, that ESV has been a little bit harder to source. Bob,
So I switched
Bob,
to
get back to mixing those
Brightwell.
elements.
I know. That's been my tried and true for decades. When I've used two-part, but so I gave Brightwell a try, knowing it's a little more concentrated. So I just eyeballed mathed it, right? Like, oh, okay. I did use a Reef online calculator. Like, well, if I'm dosing this many milliliters of ESV, that's the equivalent of this many milliliters of Brightwell.
Mm-hmm.
End of story. Maybe I got my tank volume not right, because you try to rough that with like rock and sand, and how many gallons really is.
So what happened?
So anyway, my alkalinity dropped to 4.5, and I was like, all right, I got to go correct that. But I'm correcting that in 24 hours, right? And that nice thing with the controller is I just set it to a higher value
Nice thing
for
about
the
a
24-hour
dosing
period.
pump, a smart dosing pump.
Sorry, yeah, that's
Like,
what I
you
meant.
can use a controller with a super loud, grindy stepper motor dosing pump. I'll use just a smart dosing pump, and I will tell it to dose 100 mLs of buffer in an hour.
Yeah, so that's what I did. Is I wasn't gonna do it over like several days. I'm like, no, 24 hours is fine,
I will do it over an hour.
Yeah, I could, but I'm not actively watching my pH, so I was like, yeah.
I guess I think it maybe comes from having a bunch of tanks and being a little bit more maverick with my dosing. I have dosed too much calcium. You know what happens? Acro polyp extension pulls in for a little bit. They're over it in like a couple hours. Stability is hyper important over the long range, but we should not put this incredibly tight range on a lot of different aquarium parameters like it's a religion, Yeah, no, that was a
Well, to tie that to the temperature thing, when other people started trying the elevated temperature with dinos, I was surprised how many people gave feedback like, I stopped doing this within 3 days because my corals were pissed off that the temperature was 82 degrees. And I was like, that just is odd to me that your corals are, looking stressed at 82 degrees Fahrenheit.
Mm-hmm.
When our tanks used to be that hot when we used to cook them with metal halides, right?
Yeah, 80 degrees used to be the low.
But maybe it's like what you said, maybe these tanks are kept in such a tight parameter range that, all of a sudden going to 82 is like, these corals are like, what the hell's going on, right? Versus maybe in my tank, they're like, yeah, okay, let's go for this ride. Let's see what happens.
Here's a fun fact for you. Fast-growing SPS stony corals occur in shallow water of tropical regions. Shallow water tends to be a lot warmer, and calcification speeds up in higher temperatures. So if you're trying to grow SPS stony corals, you should be aiming for about 80 plus degrees. That's a fact of chemistry. That's why lime builds up in your pumps where there's a heat source, or it builds up and crusts up on your heater where there's a heat source. Those same physical properties are happening inside your corals. If you want to grow stony corals faster, you might be, you bump your pH up to 8.5, run the temperature up to 85. It might be really hard to keep up with the whole suite of trace elements and minerals that they need at that temperature, but at the very least, a real acro tank should be about 80 plus.
Well, yeah, that was what was so weird to me, is that people had a negative reaction. I mean, tanks used to be hot in the summertime. I remember people would be like, what's your reef tank? Oh, in the summer it's this temperature, in the winter it's that temperature. That was a very common response. So, and maybe we had less issues with dinos before because our tanks, ran hotter in spite of us, right? Because our lighting was a lot more of a heat source. I don't know.
No, I mean, these are all excellent points. We're literally not trying to break all of your commandments of reefing with this entire conversation. Right. We're just asking you to examine what it is that you're doing. yes, you should stop acclimating
Ask
your coral.
why.
Like, that's just silly. That's just silly. But I only have a couple more, porosity. I really am like just kind of, my jaw hits the floor when I see people with established reef tanks adding media blocks to their sump.
The ceramic
It doesn't
stuff,
matter. It doesn't matter what it is.
BioPure or whatever.
It doesn't matter. It's like, your tank is fine. I've always...
Well, I never understood biological media in a reef tank, period.
Yeah, the corals and
your whole tank is biological media.
The voice of Jeff Goldblum flows through me. Nature will find a way. Bacteria will find a way. But I am just flabbergasted is the appropriate word when people have an established tank, an established fish population, and they add biomedia to their sump. All you're doing is adding a place for more detritus to build up, slowing down the water flow in places where it probably should be faster. And I judge the usefulness of almost everything we do on our reef tanks based on whether or not I can look at a reef tank and determine whether someone has a high alkalinity, if they're, have enough nutrients, if they're dosing, a proper balance of amino acids, if they have, good water flow in the aquarium. But you cannot look at an aquarium and say, oh man, this reef tank looks like it's got a ton of porosity. I need more porosity in my reef tank. I'm going to add some bioblocks, media blocks in my sump. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I've always questioned that one. I know there's some theory that because they're so porous in nature that you're creating an anoxic zone for denitrifying bacteria, but I've always thought that they just clog up anyway,
right?
Eventually with detritus. And if you've got high nitrates in a reef tank, there's a bio block ain't gonna, in my opinion, fix it. And you gotta look at like why that is, because these days I feel like nitrates are relatively easy to take care of in a reef
Easier
tank.
than ever. Man, you have companies.
Yeah.
Brightwell makes neonitro and neophos so you can add them to your tank. That was my last big hurdle here at the Reef Builder Studio. I thought, I'm feeding the corals a little bit, feeding the fish a little bit, got a little bit of algae growth on the glass. Okay, it must have nutrients. But then when the Hannah Checker came out, the low range one, I had 0.00 on the 600 gallon system, 0.05 on my flagship reef, and 0.17 parts per million on the tank that was doing the best. And I'm like, okay, that's the last thing I really need to do here at the studio, was just feed my tanks a lot more. So yeah, having high nitrates. You know what I'm going to blame for that? Frozen food.
Mm-hmm.
Frozen food. Again, almost everything we're talking about, right? Whether it's acclimating your corals or providing more porosity or keeping your tank hyperstable, these are all like lumped into this folder of trying to give your tank the best. But if you think about raising a child, you give them all the best and you never give them any rough edges to scratch themselves onto. They're going to be a spoiled little brat and totally sheltered and not going to learn anything. So similar with the reef tank, you wouldn't feed your child steak and seafood 3 times a day, right? You're not going to keep your child in a hyperbaric, climate controlled bubble their entire lives. They have to learn in some ways how to handle some of the extremes of everything that we're talking about.
I think I have a very dissenting opinion about fish feeding and coral feeding that we could definitely dive into in another video. But yeah, there is a general sense of, if you've got nutrient issues, maybe if your bio load's high, that's one thing, but maybe look at how much you're feeding the tank.
That's what I'm saying, though. But you know how hard it's going to be to skyrocket your nitrates and phosphates if you're feeding flake food? It's like it's economically impossible. Do you know how much buckets of flake food you'd have to have? But with frozen food, it's so concentrated. Not only are you fattening up your fish from the inside, but so much of that goes undigested, goes straight into your water quality.
Yeah, I've never been much. I mean, I like frozen food here and there as a treat, but I swear by just pellets and flake. And it's just funny, you're gonna feed your. Nothing wrong with wanting the best for your fish, but it's funny to see people like feed their reef tank this diverse, like you said, steak and mashed potato meal every night,
Twice
and
a
then
day.
like their dog gets like the same kibble every
Right.
night. You know.
It's just we want the best for our aquariums, but frozen food should be three things. One, it should be for conditioning new fish. They've had a long ride, they've lost a lot of weight, they need to settle into the aquarium. New fish. Conditioning fish for breeding, right? This should be for, when you really need to get high quality eggs. If you're a breeder, you know who you are. That's when you feed frozen food all the time. And three, as part of a balanced diet of flakes and pellets and grazing the aquarium and, whatever they can find breeding within the aquarium.
Yeah, out of sheer laziness, I've been most 95, 90, sometimes it's like 99% of the time, I just feed pellets and flake.
Right there with you, brother.
Knock on wood, because I'm probably, this is going to curse me somehow, but I have never, full confession, I've never had a tang with lateral line issues ever in the hobby.
I have, when I'm specifically treating a Zebrasoma purple tang for ick and with copper for a while.
Yeah.
Or in cases where I added just a little bit too much carbon to the tank.
Yeah.
But those are very well
if you
explainable. But yeah, I'm right there with you. I think the first food that really turned me onto that was New Life Spectrum. Man, I have grown some big old fat fish on 99.99% New Life Spectrum.
Of choice for me. Yep, that's what I predominantly use. I've started trying some other pellets to mix in, just because why not? But I mean, the Regal Angel I had for more than a decade, he was raised on pellets, right? And sure, somebody's thinking, well, he would have lived 20 years if I had fed frozen food.
He would have lived
more
5
often,
years if you fed him exclusively frozen food. I love how this whole misconception thing is just now like we're focusing on overfeeding. But yeah, he would have lived half as long if you fed him exclusively frozen food, because he would have been a super fat boy. But we want to save some of this material for a future episode on specifically nutrition. But yeah, again, I don't want to be chastising anyone for doing any one of these particular things. It just really goes into people, killing their aquarium with kindness.
Yeah. I mean, they want the best, and if you can, if you want to use the best of the best of the best for everything because you're passionate and you care, and there's more power to you. That's great. But to your point, it's important to question some of that stuff, and also not to chastise people that maybe do it a little differently.
Yeah. I've been working on that my entire life. I'm kind of bad at being like, no, you're doing it wrong. Stop it.
I'm always intrigued, right? When like the guy that runs his tank on tap water and the tank's phenomenal, you're always like, okay, hold on, what's going on here? I'm always fascinated, right? Like in one of the previous episodes I talked about, the ultimate flex for me would always be like, oh, what kind of skimmer you running? Like, oh yeah, that thing broke like a year ago, and you're like, oh, okay, cool, interesting.
The skimmer really helps with the balance of the tank, but there's something to be said when there's a perfect equilibrium, or an ideal equilibrium between whatever organics are building up in the aquarium and not having a protein skimmer.
I know we're running long, but there's one I wanted to ask you about your opinion on is pH.
Oh, what about pH?
Elevated pH definitely improves coral growth. Do you think people are going a little crazy on pH now with all the carbon dioxide absorption media?
I don't think soda lime is the answer.
Or like
pull your air in from outside,
tapping a hole for your for your air line for your skimmer to the outside world, which I don't know.
I do think here's the thing, like, again, pH and calcification could be its whole session overall, where we'll probably revisit that. But there's kind of a catch-22, and I've experienced this too. And I'm in my own personal pH club of 1, I call it club 8.5. And when I scratch 8.5 with the tank full of corals, you can easily hit 8.5 on a daily when you don't really have any corals in there. But it's like a race car. You're driving it faster. And so it makes it so much harder to keep up with mineral demands. It makes it so much harder to keep up with nutrition. It makes it, that much more of a challenge to supply amino acids and just all the things that the corals need. So when it comes to obviously, you need to dive into the details. If you're growing zoanthus and soft corals, who cares? Who cares about the pH? Yeah. If you're growing LPS and Euphilia, maybe a little bit of an effect. But if you're growing acros and you're farming acros, you are wasting your time if you're not at least hitting 8.3, 8.1 to 8.3.
That's a good point. I guess if you were in the coral farming business, that'd be one thing. For me, I've had SPS dominant tanks. I've had, all kinds of flavor of tanks. And especially when I was running calcium reactors, I was always in the 7.9, 8.0 range on the reef.
If I wake up and my pH is that low, I will shed a tear.
I've just never had problems.
You're not wrong. There's something to be said for not giving a hoot. And you know what I meant to say. For not giving a hoot. There's something to be said for not growing your corals fast, right? Having an aquascape kind of slowly evolving, right? Like, all right, my nano tank up front, I never dose it. I have no idea what the pH is. It's had 2 water changes. It went 1 year without a water change, and it's had 1 second water change since then. Those corals grow. They grow just fine. Right? Yeah. There's some actual acans in there. There's 2 euphyllias, some green star polyp, a couple soft corals. I don't care what the chemistry is. I don't care what the pH is, right? So if if you want your exhibit, your display to kind of stay the same, don't worry about pH. Don't worry about turbocharging growth, because on a long enough timeline, you're just going to have to manage it, right? You're going to have to restart your coral. You're going to have to do some fragging. You're going to have to do something with all those frags. You're going to have to supply so much more to the tank. But yeah, I think that what you're trying to get at is that exceedingly large high pH is not for everyone.
Yeah, and just the number chasing thing. To your point, if you're trying to squeeze every little drop out of growth, right? I guess it makes sense. But I honestly, when I ran a calcium reactor, I never tested anything. I knew what the pH was on my calcium reactor, so I knew it was running properly. Once I started switch back to dosing, I do once a month test my alkalinity.
Once a month,
just to make sure.
Oh my lordy!
Well, unless I see the coral, I'm big on.
I know you. Observation, man, that's key. All right. Well, I think we're bifurcating into a bunch of different topics. Do you have any closing statements about misconceptions, so we don't dabble into like 3 different future episodes at the end of this one?
Yeah. No, I don't want it to be. I don't want anybody to interpret this as cynical or chastisey or anything like that. I just it's good when you get advice to understand the why behind it, and I think it's important to dive into the particulars. Right? Don't look at some guy running a tap water tank and think he's doing it wrong, because you don't know what his water quality is like. When it comes to fish feeding or anything like that, like, I hate when people get preachy about it, and then you could argue that we're being preachy, but I'm more talking about the people that...
It's not preachy when we're telling people to give an extra level of consideration to what they're doing and why they're doing that. We're not saying, don't do this, except for coral acclimation. There's absolutely no reason. Except for coral acclimation. But yeah, we're just urging... This is a hobby. It's cerebral. It's multidimensional. This is why we're here, to think about this stuff, to understand this stuff, and don't just go repeating and what someone else said or repeating what someone else did. Just think and be critical about everything that you are personally doing.
Agreed.
Very cool.
Perfect.
Well,
way to
on
put
that
it.
note, Mark, thank you so much for another awesome session of reef therapy. I feel a little bit lighter every time we get some of these things off our chests. And yeah, I hope the viewers and the listeners have found this informative, and very appreciative of everyone tuning in.
Yeah, I look forward to the comments. I'm sure there'll be some folks with their own ideas of some misconceptions, or maybe they're doing some things that, you know, they feel are not common that other people are doing. And that'll be fun to read. So, but yeah, thanks, Jake. This was fun.
Yeah, I had a few more items on my
Um,
list, but we're already running long. So if you have some major misconceptions you want to bring to light, make sure to pop those down in the comments of the YouTube video. I know you can't really do that in the podcast format, but thanks everyone for tuning in. Make sure to catch us on your favorite podcatcher, and we'll catch you guys for another session of Reef Therapy next week.
All right. See
Later.
you guys.